Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reske.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Welcome back to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm your host, Greg Bryan. I'm joined with my co-host, Jim Reske, and we have a special guest with us tonight, Pastor Jim, who is an old friend of mine that we go way back, and the three of us are going to have a discussion on the first half of the book of Job, Job's chapter 1 through 31. The very first verse is, "In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job." And we're going to talk about him tonight. But before we get into that, let's introduce, for our audience sake, Pastor Jim. Pastor Jim, introduce yourself and tell us how it came to be that you joined us on this podcast.
My name is Jim Folk. I'm a pastor in Cary, North Carolina, just outside of Raleigh. And Greg and I have known each other for a long time. I think the first time we met was probably spring of 1996, I want to say, somewhere around there.
That sounds about right.
And I think Greg and I first met at maybe service at a church plant in Wadsworth, Ohio. I was right out of college and was a high school math teacher for a couple of years. And I had met Greg, and he said, "Hey, I need a roommate." Or don't you want to be roommates or something like that? I don't know. I forget how it came up, but we got to know each other a little bit. And then we were roommates for about a little over a year. And and then he decided to do the Navigators thing. So that was pretty cool. Because I can remember specifically, Greg, the one conversation you told me, you said, "This is all about discipling students. And this is always what I've wanted to do. Or this is always what I've dreamed of doing," or something to that effect. So that was pretty cool to kind of be there at that God moment of your life when you realize that was kind of like your new calling, that God was calling you to work with students and meet one-on-one, and so that was pretty neat.
Yeah, those were the days, man. You and I were both young and single. I think we're in our mid-20s, or I'm a little older than you, but we used to, we had spent had a lot of good times together, hanging out and doing fun stuff, and then living together was fun too. Although I'm going to tell a story on you, Jim, Pastor Jim.
I bet I know which one it is.
I think you do. Yeah. So the funny thing is, whenever I ate, we lived together, so whenever I would eat a meal, I would clean my dish right away, and then I put it back in the cupboard. And then Jim, on the other hand, liked to let his dishes pile up through the week. And so I'll never forget, one Friday night or Saturday morning or something like that, Jim turns to me, he goes, "Hey, Greg, how about we do the dishes?" And I started laughing. I'm like, none of those dishes are mine. Those are all your dishes, and you want we to do the dishes. I just thought that was just so funny. But it also says a lot about Jim, because he is a great friend, and we did.
And I still ask my kids to do that. Why don't we do the dishes?
It's a great opportunity to serve.
Right. So,
and Greg was very efficient as a bachelor, because he only used one plate and one cup per day. I can remember he would have a bagel in the morning with a Coca-Cola, and that was about it. And he would use the same glass, and he would leave the glass on the counter so he could use that, later on in the evening. So, yeah. I still
actually have that habit. I have one glass that I use. My wife could show you, I could, go get it. I do. As far as the glass goes, I gave up the Coke in the morning though.
Oh, okay.
Finally.
Okay. Yeah.
But
I can remember there were a lot of mornings where it was like a bagel and a Coke was breakfast, and But one funny thing I remember is now this is going back a few years, but I remember Greg was usually, especially on the weekends, since I was a school teacher. So if I could sleep in on the weekends, I would. But Greg was usually up before me on the weekends, and so he would come in the room, and sometimes he would turn on the light. And so Greg was always joking around and trying to think of, different ways just to keep things fun, humorous, and whatnot. And so that was around the time I think Frank Peretti had written the books, This Present Darkness and Piercing the Darkness. And so when I would be, kind of half awake on a Saturday morning or whatnot, the room was still dark. Greg would lean in the doorway and he'd say, "This Present Darkness," and then he'd flick the light switch, and the light would come on, and he'd say, "Piercing the Darkness." And then we'd joke about, "Hey, it's time to get up," or, what are you going to do today? So that was just a fun little story about when we were roommates. So
Greg, that sounds like your kind of humor.
Man,
yeah.
I'm so glad I
Play on
grew
words.
up. I'm so glad I grew up.
We both got a kick out of it at the time. That was kind of fun.
We did. Well,
around. Sorry to Frank Peretti for for the reference there, but
one of the things I'm notorious for is telling jokes and I'm the one who laughs. So if the joke makes me laugh, then I think then it's the best joke, So remember Jim Reske, remember when we first started the podcast, I tried to do that the joke part.
Yeah,
remember?
Joke of the day or dad jokes or some tagline for it.
Yeah, sticky jokes or something
Sticky
like that.
jokes. Yes, we should bring that segment back.
Yeah, I tried to have an institutional segment on our podcast where we would share jokes every time, but then life happened and
Well, I do have one for you since I was a former math teacher.
Okay.
Where does a math teacher go for vacation?
Where?
Times Square.
Oh, Times Square. Okay. Well, my math joke is 5 out of every 4 people have problems with fractions.
That's right. That's right.
Or there's 3 types of math people. There's those who are good at math and those who aren't.
That's right. 3 types.
There's 3 types, but all righty. Well, let's dive into the book of Job. So I'm going to start with Jim Reske. You're coming up to the plate to teach this. What are some of the big observations you're making so far in your research?
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So just in terms of structure, at our Bible study when we're teaching, we're going to be dividing this into 2 parts. So I'm going to be taking Job 1 through 31, and then a colleague of ours is going to take the rest of it. So kind of divides the book up. It's not quite in half, but it kind of divides it up thematically into 2 different sections. So there's a lot of Job that's understood in terms of how as a whole. So some of what I'll be doing is setting up some of these kind of questions and then resolving them. Although I do think one thing I've observed is that in Job, the narrator, the writer, is really good about setting up tensions. But as we all know, the main tension of the book, why is God allowing suffering, is unresolved to the very end. So kind of not to steal the thunder, but it's one of the big questions of the book. But I was actually hoping maybe with 2 seminarians on the call, one of you could give a very brief overview for our audience. Someone's never read Job before and says, "Job? I thought it was Job." Like, what's that book about? It's J-O-B. It looks like job in English, but what's that about? Maybe he gets as our guest, Pastor Jim. I can put you on the spot if you are going to sum up Job and the whole book in a few sentences for the numbers who's never read it before. How'd you summarize it? Oh, wait, and Pastor Jim, I think you're on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, the book of Job is basically deals with the question of suffering.
Uh-oh. His internet is suffering.
Yes.
And he's probably going to have to call back in or something.
Yeah, probably.
So he was saying that the book of Job is about suffering. We'll see if he... Oh, there. Are you back?
There we go. I'm back. Yes.
All right. We'll start over again.
Your internet was suffering.
Okay.
So you were saying,
I was saying basically Job has to do with the question of suffering. There's a man in the man who the book is about, Job, is he's referred to as a righteous man before God. And in the beginning of the book, God and Satan basically have an agreement, uh, for lack of a better word, to say let's have an experiment here. And Satan is allowed to test Job in various ways, to where he takes away Job's family, he takes away Job's livelihood, he afflicts Job with physical suffering. And so let's see if Job really wants to worship God or not. Let's see if
Right.
Job really stays true to God. And God says, okay, you can test Job, but you can't take his life. So then the middle of the section of the book is Job's friend's response to his suffering, and also Job's own response, processing his suffering. And then there's a fourth friend that comes along, in addition to the first three, who enters the dialogue. And then the end of the book of Job is Job finally getting his hearing with God, his court date with God, if you will, and then God answering Job at the end. And so there's that's the basic format of it.
but then he
Yes,
gets everything back. He gets,
And well, that's the spoiler alert, Greg. If you haven't read
don't
the
go
book of
see the
Job.
movie.
Yeah, yeah. So Job is restored in terms of his possessions, in terms of he has children again, and whatnot. And but the question is, how does Job process what God tells him at the end?
Yeah, and
That's
so,
right.
and I would say, it's one of the most unique books in the Bible because it's set in this place called Uz, which I'm pretty sure we don't even exactly know where it is, or maybe Jim, you found out there. It's far away from Israel, so in some senses, it doesn't make sense that it's in the Bible because it doesn't really have anything to do with Israel. And then all the characters are non-Israelites, and there's no clear historical setting of the book. Which, unless now, I could be wrong. Jim, did you find out anything different, or is
That's
that
one of the first. It's one of the things I try to do, Greg, as we know, is we have some really, really bright people in our study, and they love to ask really piercing questions. And so, Jim, it keeps us on our toes. We really need to kind of be ready for that. And so we look up kind of Bible difficulties and the kind of, what are the obvious questions you should be ready for? And one of the first ones was this: is Job really a historical figure or a fictional character? It's a nice story. You actually, as you mentioned, it starts off talking about Job and how blameless he is. And then you go to this background conversation in heaven between God and Satan talking about Job. And then you have all these long poetic discourses where, Job's friends say something and Job replies, all very eloquent. And the whole thing is, well, is it someone just wrote this later as a nice story? Or are they real people? The commentators I read were, Christian commentators, but basically came down and said, no, it's really, you could argue that and look at it both ways, but there are references to Job as an individual, like in the book of Ezekiel. Job is referenced along with Noah and Daniel and Job, the three of them as individuals, as real people. So the same way Noah and Daniel were real individuals, the Bible in Ezekiel refer to Job as a real character as well. And then Job comes up also in the book of James in the New Testament. James references Job's perseverance. So in terms of the biblical narrative, the biblical evidence, it is referencing Job as a real character. But I think you're right, Greg, in terms of like exactly when did it take place and exactly when was it written? Lots of uncertainty about that. I think a lot of people think, and I've thought for years, it's the oldest book in the Bible. I've heard that many, many times. People say this was written before anything, the most ancient book, and other people say no, it was written later. Some of the language looks like it was more recent, but I don't think people really know. So I do think it's really well loved. I mean, everybody seems to love the book of Job. I bet you, Pastor Jim, when you were preaching on this, people just ate it up and just love talking about people. It was my father's favorite book of the Bible. People love Job, love talking about it. It really connects with people, maybe because it's the theme of suffering, which is just universal, right? Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think people really identify with Job as an individual.
Yeah.
It's funny. I was at a licensing meeting for someone in the Evangelical Free Church, and in your licensing document, you have to give scripture references for, you're stating your personal theology as it relates to the Free Church statement of faith and all that. And the person was writing about, the difficulty of suffering or following Christ, and she just put parentheses the book of Job. And I thought, well, yeah, that certainly identifies with it. You could go many places in the book of Job and just see examples of him trying to process his own suffering. And so that just, I just give that example because that exemplifies how people just identify that one biblical character. They identify with that one biblical character, I think, much more than they might say a Daniel or a King David or Deborah from the book of Judges. People just gravitate, I think, in their mind and in their experience to, is this a trial that I'm going through, like something similar that Job went through?
Yeah, Job's kind of the central question of why am I suffering? It's just universal. Everyone kind of thinks about that, Greg.
Yeah. So I have a comment and then a question. My comment is, how cool is it that it's part of the wisdom literature?
Right.
It's part of, it kind of goes along with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And so the idea is it's supposed to give us wisdom, although it doesn't answer the question about suffering, because I think it still doesn't answer the question. But then the question I have, Jim, is, did you do any research yet on the authorship of it?
No. Did you have any thoughts on that, or did you? Or
I don't think anybody knows. I don't think we know.
It's definitely not in the first person, right?
Which is it's an amazing piece of literature to be anonymous.
It is. Well, so that's part of the literary aspects of it. I thought, and I'm still learning about it, but some of that was really kind of very interesting to me. They say the use of language here is really higher order language. There are words used in Job that are not used anywhere else in Scripture. So you're sometimes using, you said this to me before, Greg. I learned this from you, that the Hebrew language doesn't have that many characters, doesn't have that many words, right? Compared to English, isn't that true?
Right. Yes.
And so oftentimes in the books of the Bible, you understand what you're saying in the book of Daniel, for example, because that same word will be used in Ezekiel and so on. All through the Bible, you can understand Scripture through Scripture. But there's so much in Job that's not written that way. That's higher order. It's like a literary masterpiece. And then the one thing I thought when I was looking at that part of it, I was listening to a lecture, and I got a bunch of different sources. One of whom, we always try to give the sources, but for full attribution, listen to a Tim Keller sermon on Job, and I was listening to some work from the Bible Project. But they were pointing out that the literary tension, the way the writer sets it up, is so great, because if you didn't have those first couple chapters where they have that conversation between God and Satan, and you just went into Job's suffering and the friends' responses, you would hear the friends say, well, Job, you must have done something wrong to deserve this suffering. And you kind of will play into that. But the writer sets it up front by saying, God says this servant is blameless. So the first part of it is he's holy and righteous. In fact, he's so holy and righteous that he offers sacrifices for his children. He's such a great guy. And then God and Satan talking about him, and God offers to Satan, have you seen my servant Job? And God is testifying how great Job is. So it's clear that we as readers know that, but none of the other characters do, which sets up this amazing tension as they're talking it over. We know the backstory and they don't, and they don't. So Job says, I'm innocent. And you were like, as readers, we say, yeah, we know you are. The other guy's going to say, how dare you say you're innocent? And so, and then of course, like we said a couple of times already, the tension isn't really resolved. So most writers will set up a great tension to resolve it. This just sets up that tension that carries it all the way through. It's really magnificent. It's I'm kind of reading and seeing it as I read more commentaries on it, seeing it at a whole new light.
Is there a Bible? Is there a Bible difficulty here? Just the whole idea that God kind of like uses Job as a, I don't know. I mean, the idea that God just uses him for this big test.
Yeah. There are a number of Bible difficulties like that. And I think you could spend a lot of time just in the first two chapters talking about that, right? It's like God and Satan making a bet. like it sounds like the movie Trading Places with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd. Like it sounds like these, they're just toying with Job's life. And wait, part of the bet, all his kids get wiped out too. All those lives are lost. That's just part of God's. It seems so callous and cold. The modern reader could just stop in their tracks right there and say, this is not a God I want to know at all. I mean, it's just lots of questions like that. Controversies raised by this. And you kind of got to, if you want to get to the meat of it, get beyond some of that stuff. I do have something I wanted to bounce off you guys. I was thinking I was doing this when I got to teach on this. I have a little Bernedoodle dog. It's a miniature Bernedoodle. And it's really cute, real fluffy. And my dog loves me to death. And I was thinking of embedding a video into the talk because my dog loves me. And I know my dog loves me because every time I'm getting a snack at night, my dog will just stand there and look at me and stare at me. And I'll look at my kids and I say, have you seen my dog? And his name is Obi. Have you seen my dog, Obi? Behold, my dog loves me. Look how my dog Obi loves me, and he loves me for me. And I always tell the same joke, and my kids don't think it's funny anymore. But I say, my dog loves me for me. And they say, no, take away his snack and he will curse you to your face. And it's exactly the setup for the book of Job, where Satan is saying, God says, Job is wonderful. Look how wonderful he is. He loves me. And Satan says, come on. He doesn't love you. He loves your stuff. You treat him so well. Of course he loves you. That's the bet. But I do think little controversies like that, you got to get beyond.
And one of the questions is, God initiates. One of the questions that I would think, as studying the book of Job, you have to process, well, what's behind this? God initiates this encounter. The scripture says that God doesn't tempt anyone, and he himself is not tempted by evil. And yet here God initiates this challenge, if you will, between himself and Satan.
Right.
Kind of like the same tension you have where it says Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness in the Gospels, that Satan is the tempter in the wilderness, but yet Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness.
Yes.
So kind of that tension of God presenting this whole encounter.
There's a theme there on the accuser. Don't remind me. We'll come back to that. But this notion of God and Satan having this really kind of casual conversation, and this is another Bible difficulty that was noted. Like they're just talking, and God is very almost like casual familiarity with Satan. Where you come from? Oh, we're roaming about the earth. Have you seen my servant Job? There's like this friendly, casual conversation. One of the questions is, does that still happen today? Does Satan and God talk about us as individuals that way? And then the controversy of where does the evil come from? And you were starting to go there, Jim. Like, is God the author of the evil? Does he, all these awful things that come in, is God the source of that? And so one of the commentators I was quickly squashed that, said, no, God is not the author of that, but God allows it. He's always in control, but it's Satan doing the one of taking the kids away, and Satan is taking the wealth away. Satan's the sores and all the bad things that happen to Job. It's always Satan, the author of the bad things. Of course, that raises a question now, if bad things happen to me today, is that Satan doing it? I got a flat tire. Is that Satan doing that? Or is that just, I got a flat tire? It's where I drove over the nail. It's where the world works, right? Anyway, lots of little rabbit holes.
And even with his children, there's different ways in which the calamity comes to them.
How's that?
Because some of the children are attacked by the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans, and then other ones die because there was a wind that came and blew the shelter over onto them. So
natural disaster.
So even in that, you have man-made calamity or man-caused calamity, and then you have the idea of natural calamity.
Right. So in the man-caused calamity, Satan is clearly doing this. We know that Satan is behind this, but the Chaldeans are attacking. So then Satan must have caused this other army troop to initiate the attack on the kids. Anyway, lots of questions like that. You could spend all kinds of time. I think if you do that, you'll get away from the big picture themes of the book of Job, which are suffering. And the other big theme, I knew it was all about suffering, Greg, but the other big thing as I was reading about it is this big philosophical question of how does the world really work? And that's why I think it's in wisdom literature, is because I think that most of the talks I've heard about Job, most of the lessons I heard about Job are all about suffering, how to deal with suffering. When you ask, why am I suffering? But when you read through all the dialogues, which I'm on the hook for in a couple of weeks, so much of it is this core question of how exactly does the world work? The guy from the Bible Project, I listened to his lecture. He had a great breakout, but he is quoting somebody else. I think he was quoting one of his seminary professors. So we, we all have different sources. But he said, you think about it this way, there are three different principles in the book. And this is a way to diagram and think about it. He drew it as a triangle. Maybe I'll put it on the screen as a triangle, Greg, or just list them. But the one is God's justice. The other is Job's innocence. And the third is the retribution principle. And that third one, the retribution principle, is the idea that it's good things are supposed to happen to good people and bad things are supposed to happen to bad people. And everyone believes that, and no matter what your faith is, everyone believes that. If you're a secular humanist and you see someone who's in jail because they were wrongly accused of this murder, and then 40 years later, the DNA proves them innocent, you say, oh, it's a tragedy. They lost their life. They're wrongly accused. And everyone thinks that's wrong. Even if you're totally secular, no one says, well, what difference does life make anyway? So he lost 40 years. Who cares? Life is meaningless. It's pointless. It grates on everybody to hear that, injustice, because it's not supposed to work that way. He was innocent and he suffered. It's wrong. It's wrong. And everyone has that moral sense, because we live in whether or not you agree to, you're religious or not, everyone lives and it feels like they're in a moral universe. Yeah. And so these guys wrestle with this, and I don't know if that's the right words for it. Maybe Jim or Greg, there's maybe a better theological term. Like he called it the retribution principle, which is supposed to be good things for good people, bad things for bad people. And it's that, Job's innocence and God's justice, those three themes, and those three are irreconcilable in the book. And that is the whole tension of the narrative, because those three things cannot all be true at the same time. You can't have the retribution principle working perfectly, Job being perfectly innocent, and God being perfectly just. And all the characters in the book solve that riddle by ditching one or two of the other. They'll hang on to one of those and drop the others. Job will say, I know I'm innocent, and I'm not letting go of that. I am innocent. That's rock bad. And God is just. And so at first he says, okay, and God is just, and I'm going to accept it all. But then the retribution principle can't be right. He starts abandoning it. And there's this fascinating progression in the course of the book where Job at first is saying, oh, I could never question God. He's so holy and just. And then later, midway through, he's like, if I had a chance, I would talk to him about this. It's like in chapter 13. And when the dialogues, he starts saying, yeah, if I would. And then later he says, no, I couldn't. I couldn't. But I would, but he's so strong, I couldn't. But towards the end, he's like, I want my case. I have a case with him. I want my day in court, and I would win. I would win because I'm right. So at the end, he holds on to his own innocence, and he starts to question God's justice, and he definitely questions the retribution principle, but he wavers back and forth on those. The other guys, of course, never let go of the retribution principle, never let go of God's justice, and they completely torch Job's innocence, right? And there's like, you must have done something. And when he says, no, I haven't, like that angers him even more, right? There you go, proclaiming innocence. How he can't believe you're even doing this. And they start, I don't know if you remember this, they start taunting each other. They're actually, the opening chapters of all their poems are almost nasty with each other. Oh, you think you've got wisdom? I've got wisdom too. That kind of stuff.
One of his friends actually says, Job, you deserve worse.
Yes, it's a great verse.
In chapter 11, verse 6, I think it says, know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves.
Yeah.
So, you're not getting enough of it, Job.
Right.
Right.
Wow.
And as pastors and as a preacher, Job is something that you have to be really careful with.
How so?
Pastorally. So I think sometimes as a pastor, it's easy to trot out a verse like, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Or Job did not sin in any way by charging God with wrongdoing in the opening chapters.
Right.
And it's easy to use those verses in a sermon without really sitting with people and and recognizing the depth of their suffering, their trials, whatever it might be. So I think there's some principles there that Job is still worshiping God in the midst of having all these things taken away. And worship is a theme that sort of comes in the beginning and at the end of the book. Mm-hmm. Because the question is, does Job worship God for nothing? And that's kind of a question we can ask ourselves every day. Do I worship God for nothing?
Yes.
Do I worship God only because he gives me these blessings, these possessions, this family, this career? So there is an existential question of worship in terms of who are you going to worship every day?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. That's really key. And this notion that the difference between being instrumental or intrinsic, right? So is God instrumental to something else in your life? So like a hammer is instrumental to something else. I use a hammer for a function to pound a nail.
A functional savior.
A functional savior, right? But a intrinsic savior is when I just love it. Intrinsic love is like liking a painting. I just love it for the painting. It's just beautiful. It doesn't do anything for me. It's just beautiful. I just love it intrinsically. Right. And you love God intrinsically, worship him intrinsically, or you worship him for something that he can give you, right? And this is kind of jumping ahead, Jim, to like the end of the book, which I'm not supposed to do because I'm only doing the first half. But I think this is kind of the punchline for the book, and then we can keep talking about other details and stuff. You're hitting the punchline is God can't tell Job why he's suffering. Keller brings this out when Keller preaches on this. Keller says, if people say, why am I suffering? And if you're paying pastoral ministry, I think, you've got to deal with people's heart at that moment when they're in the middle of suffering. You can't start talking about intellectual answers, right? They're in the middle of dealing with grief or something. You got to be like Job's friends at the beginning and suffer with them, right? But if people want to know why, if I only do why, I could get through it. And what Keller brings out that if God says to Job, look, you're going to get it all back many times over. And Job says, oh, yeah, okay, in that case, okay, I'm good. Then Satan wins the bet because Job says, now I know what's in it for me. And I'm good and I can suffer. I'm okay. And Keller points out, said, if you need to go through suffering in your life, we all do, but somewhere where you have no clue because it'll test you whether do you love God just for him? Or do you say, now I see why I'm going through this because in the end, I'm going to get such and such. Even if I'm going to get heaven, right? If I'm something in it for moi, then God is not, I don't love him intrinsically. I love him instrumentally. And I'll probably need to go through suffering again until I learn that lesson because I haven't learned it yet.
Mm-hmm. And this is one of the reasons we do this podcast is because we talk a lot about the difference between religion and the gospel and how religion does function on there's something in it for me. I love God because in other words, we want the benefits of knowing God, his blessings more than we want God himself. We worship him because he's useful, not because he's beautiful. And that's where if you really are gripped by the gospel for your salvation, but also for your sanctification, you want to know God because he's beautiful.
Right.
You've given up the idea that you can somehow control him and make him useful. You just want to know him because he's so beautiful, because the gospel itself is so beautiful. It not only saves you, it's what sanctifies you. And so, this is really cool. This is interesting.
Yeah. I guess if I could put a question back to Jim is, how would you differentiate between the principle of retribution that you mentioned and the idea that is either similar or overlaps with it in some way of, a man reaps what he sows. God cannot be mocked.
Yeah,
it says in Galatians. So kind of how do those either overlap or not overlap?
Yeah, and not to throw a question back and answer a question with a question. We'll talk about it together.
No, Jesus did that. Jesus.
Answer me this, and then I will answer you. No, but I bet you in your ministry, just either in your ministry, or just hearing, in our Christian worlds, how many times have you heard the phrase, "Look, to the extent you live by Christian principles, your life will go better." Isn't that true? If you don't live by Christian principles, you commit adultery, you cheated your job, you embezzle money, you lie, cheat, and steal, you do substance abuse. If you don't live by Christian principles, your life starts to fall apart. And even if you're not a believer, to the extent you live by Christian principles, doesn't your life go better? Isn't that true? And isn't that kind of the retribution principle? Look, good thing, if you be a good person, even if you don't believe it, be a good person and good things will happen to you. Work hard, be an honest employee, right? Don't cheat on your spouse, but if you're, and the opposite is clearly true. You don't show up on time and cheat and lie and steal, your life will fall apart. Isn't that true? That's the retribution principle, isn't it? So I'm just sure, like in ministry, I've heard that 1,000 times, right? You always hear that, and I kind of like, and I believe that it's true, but is it? Again, maybe the way to answer you is this: the way this works in Job is it universally true? Because the friends are saying it is universally true, and is universally true in the here and now. And when Job gets his nerve up by that progression Job has over the course of the book, he starts giving them back examples saying the wicked prosper and they do fine. And it's a little bit like Psalm 73. Like there's no pain in their death and they go to the grave happy. Like it's very much like, it doesn't work that way. You can say that, but there's lots and lots of examples of wicked people doing just fine. And it makes your blood boil, but that's true. And
that's what's so cool that it's in the wisdom literature genre, because like Proverbs almost makes it black and white. Fools act this way, wise people act this way,
right?
And then Ecclesiastes comes along and says, well, wait a minute, sometimes it doesn't work that way,
right?
And then Job comes along and throws another big wrench in the whole thing and says, hey, there's a lot of mystery when it comes to suffering, so we don't have to have an answer. But I always get nervous. Every year I read through the Bible. I've been doing it for like the last 26 years. I always get nervous when I read Job.
Really?
Well, because I realize like anything can happen. Like anything can happen. Why not me? Why not me? Why couldn't that happen to me?
Right.
Like it always kind of puts a little bit of fear in me, like, man. But I don't know. Jim, what do you think, Pastor Jim?
Well, I can just say as a pastor, you talk to many, many parents who did everything as best they could biblically in raising their kids, and their kids walked away from the Lord at one time or another, or are still not following the Lord. Then you talk to other parents who, didn't necessarily do the right things parenting wise or in their own marriage, and yet their kids have a strong relationship with the Lord. And so that's where it just, life has a way of humbling all of us, and so there is definitely that question that hits people personally of, boy, I thought I did all these things the right way, the biblical way, the God honoring way, and yet look at the results,
right.
But of course that just leads to the question, well, is it about you and your results, or is it about the God of the universe, bringing people to himself in all sorts of different means of situations in life?
It's
hard, but it's hard. It's very, and the thing that I try to point out to people is it's very easy as a Christian to say, well, we know that the Bible says everything happens for a reason, or Romans 8:28, all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. But unless you know that reason specifically in someone's life, then you shouldn't say everything happens for a reason when they're going through suffering,
because they say, oh, what could be the reason? Well, you're saying that I must have done something wrong or something.
Right. So it's very easy I think we say those things sometimes because we want to reassure ourselves, or we want to try to reassure the person that, God is going to bring you through this. Um, but we have to be very careful unless you're prepared to say what the exact reason is. Don't misuse Romans 8:28 when somebody is suffering. It's kind of like that proverb that says, don't sing songs to a heavy heart.
Yeah.
So there's pastoral considerations in that, but
I picture when you're dealing in terms of your pastoral role, you probably deal with the heart more than the head, right? It's probably more people saying that they're going through that. They need comfort in that moment of their life. They're grieving. They're really in agony. And it's less a seminary student who says, I want to ponder the question of, why is the world the way it is? And, it's less head. I'm sure you have lots of those, Bible studies, lots of those conversations too, but probably in your role, I imagine there's a lot of heart more than head.
Well, one of the blessings of pastoral ministry is you get to be with people at these crucial moments in their life. Whether it's a baptism, whether it's a, a wedding, funeral, marriage situation, uh, family situation. You're with them at a lot of those meaningful times, and so it is that lesson in Job. Your presence does mean a lot. Like Job's friends, maybe the most helpful thing they did was sit with him for 7 days or 5 days.
Yes.
When they first showed up, right?
The very end of chapter 2, verse 13, it says they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. That's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's like they did they started out so well. I mean, they did what most of us fail to do when our friends are suffering. 7 days, like that is just,
That's
that is so hard to do. So they started off so well, and then it turns so bad when they start, because and I think this is why it's such a valuable book, is because our default setting is to think he must have done something wrong.
That's right. That's right.
But
It's I don't want to be too hard on them. If someone came, and I have this, someone come up to me saying, I have lung cancer. My first question is, have you been smoking your whole life? I remember I asked that once, very insensitive. I was younger. They said, yes, I have. Like, oh, well, but it could happen to anybody, I'm sure. And I felt like a jerk, right? Like, but I was like one of these miserable comforters, right? I was like, must have been you. And blaming the person who was telling me they had cancer. So how awful that was. Got to repent of that even now. But it's a natural thing. If I say I'm struggling with this high cholesterol, just say, for example, you'd say, well, how many cheeseburgers have we had recently? you might, it's a natural thing to think, you think that, well, you're suffering, you probably had something to do with that. Right.
Or a practical thing is, I've seen this happen in small groups or home groups where, somebody shares something heavy, like maybe towards the end of the group and during a prayer time. And our tendency as fellow group members is to say, well, have you called a second doctor, get a different opinion? Or have you checked about this resource or that resource? Or, have you done a sleep study? Or, and it's like our first response is not, let's get on our knees before God and ask his mercy in this situation. Our tendency is to go to the the advice route, so to speak.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Instead of being the good comforters at the beginning, the good friends, you kind of sat there and listened.
Because I think partially as fellow Christians, sometimes we're uncomfortable with just the suffering being out there, and we want to solve it right away. And
that's the problem. That is the problem with being a male. Is I know this is one of my huge things, especially like in marriage. Whenever something, I just want to fix it.
Yep.
I just want to fix it, and I'll fix it as quick as possible. But a lot of times, fixing it is not what my wife wants. She just wants me to listen, and or it doesn't even have to be my wife. It could be other people. But boy, it's you You want to fix that problem as quickly as possible. That's why, I mean, 7 days and nights. Let's give these guys like a round of applause
Yeah.
for how they started. I mean, man. And that's one of the things in the Bible that recently, more recently in my Christian life, like, for example, anytime you bring up the word, a Pharisee, whenever you bring up a Pharisee in the Bible, you always think negatively about it. Well, I've started to kind of question why I do that. Like, well, wait a minute. Like Nicodemus, he was curious. Like he was actually seeking, there were good Pharisees.
Yeah.
Not all Pharisees are bad. And so a lot of times when we hear about these three friends and we know that they end up giving him bad advice, doesn't mean they were bad. Like they did something really, really good at the beginning to sit with him that long.
Oh, and there's definite wisdom and great nuggets in the things they say, even though later, to be clear, God does say, you guys got to repent for what you're doing, which is, again, the second half of the book. I don't want to bleed into that too much, but that their advice basically was bad advice, right? But they have some great nuggets. Like this is Eliphaz talking in chapter 15. What is man that he can be pure? Or who is born of woman that he can be righteous? Behold, God puts no trust in his holy ones, and the heavens are not pure in his sight. I mean, there's the notion of like there's a couple of verses where you either say this is a presage to Romans 3:23, and for all of sin and fall short of the glory of God. Like there's real truth in some of the things they're saying, even though they generally get the basic message wrong.
Okay, so here's a question. If one of his friends quoted Romans 8:28 to him, obviously we all agree that would not be a wise thing. It would, but if one of his friends at the end of the story, after he gets everything back, how would he respond? How would and a friend came along and said, Job, see, all things work together for the good of those who love him and obey him according to his purpose.
I think that would still be missing the bigger point of, is Job justified, or is God sovereign and to be worshiped in all things? Like, in one sense, yes, it's true that all things did end up for Job's good in the end, but I think the end of it points more towards just worship of the one true and living God. Job just being humbled and
Yeah.
saying, God, there's a Navigator writer, Greg Walter Henriksen. I think he passed away maybe 6 or 8 years ago, and he had a devotional that said, are you willing to serve God on his terms and not your terms? And he talked about Job. And
so what I hear you saying, Pastor Jim, is that the book of Job doesn't have to end with a good ending. He doesn't. I mean, we don't. God doesn't have to do what he does it doesn't have to end on a positive note, right? And God is still worthy of worship. Nothing has changed about the character of God.
Yeah, the character of God is consistent throughout. I guess that would be my larger point is um not to get too far off track, but part of the reason his friends are wrong is because Job's friends are wrong is because they don't know chapters 1 and 2. They don't know the conversation between God and Satan. So what his friends are saying is consistent with the Proverbs and the Psalms about, the way of the wicked will perish, Psalm 1. What they're saying is consistent with that, but it's not true in Job's case because they don't know the conversation that took place between God and Satan.
Yes, and that's the thing. I'm sorry.
So they're not as much wrong theologically as they are pastorally in Job's case, because they don't know the full story. That's where the genius of the narrator is that these friends came in and gave him truisms, gave him truths, but they didn't apply to him.
So it's the truth, the application of those truths, because I think that even in their poor comforting, their kind of mistaken take on it with the retribution principle, there is a kernel of truth in that, right? What we were talking about before about, living according to Christian principles and good things happen. In general, that is true. But ultimately, it is true. Ultimately, all evil will be punished. Ultimately, the only righteous that will stand are the people that get the righteousness because they're clothed with the righteousness of Christ, right? So ultimately, all the bad will be punished, and the goodness, the good will be separated. Ultimately, at the end of time, just not in every individual's case in life right now. And so their fault was probably, the coldness of their application to Job, right? Instead of the warmth of their initial comfort when they sat with him silently.
Right.
Well, this has been a great discussion. Believe it or not, we've gone on for quite some time. Let's just talk about closing thoughts, and Jim, do you have some closing thoughts?
Pastor Jim or the other Jim?
The other Jim,
okay.
my co-host.
Okay, I'll give one thing. Jim, I'm sorry, this has been great, but we can never have another Jim on here again, or another Greg. It just not working. I'm sorry. Well, we'll have to do better. We'll do better next time. I do have one more thing. I just think that it's really important. I'm going to try to bring this out, that I think so much of Job is messianic. Just like you have messianic Psalms, you have Psalms that are really about Jesus, right? So much of Job is really, really all about Jesus. And I there are parts of it because Job is saying, look, I am innocent. And I say in this instance, he is innocent. God says he's innocent. He didn't do anything to deserve these calamities, but he wasn't really sinless. Even he talks at one point about, well, as God made me punish me for the iniquities of my youth. So he was not a sinless person, right? He didn't do something to deserve this, but he was not sinless. We know that there's only one who was. So there's so many passages, long passages, where he goes through and and it's the cry of someone who says, I am completely sinless, and yet God is doing this to me. And it's the voice of Jesus coming through. And there are a bunch of them, but I'll read one here. This is in chapter 19. This is Job talking. And you can Job's talking, but you can hear Jesus' voice coming through. He says, he, God, has walled up my way so that I cannot pass. He has set darkness upon my paths. He has stripped from me my glory and taken the crown from my head. He breaks me down on every side, and I am gone. And my hope he has pulled up like a tree. He has kindled his wrath against me and counts me as his adversary. And then later in verse 14, my relatives have failed me. My close friends have forgotten me. And in verse 19, all my intimate friends abhor me, and those whom I have loved have turned against me. I mean, I'm not sure if Joe ever had a crown on his head or just making that up off the top of his head at the moment. But that's the voice of Jesus coming through loud and clear, saying, in all of history, there really was only one who was purely, completely innocent. And yet all of God's wrath came down on him. And you hear it so loud and clear in the voice of Job when he talks like this in a number of different places. So just want to make sure I got that out.
Right.
That's awesome. We always like to talk about how does Jesus show up. And because in the Old Testament, Christ is there. I mean, it's amazing. Definitely, that's an important theme to bring up. Pastor Jim, do you have any closing thoughts you want to share?
Sure. You're always asking, if you ask a pastor for his thoughts, you're going to get 3 points and an announcement at the end. My Baptist friends would say, here's 3 points and a few words on baptism. But no, seriously, chapter 19, you also have that hint forward to the future resurrection. Verse 25, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has thus been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. So in the Old Testament, as I understand it, you don't have a clear expression of the doctrine of the resurrection, but there's statements of a future, the resurrection of the just and the unjust. And so you have those pointers forward, definitely in chapter 19. So.
Well, I was really hoping you were going to end with that, Jim. I was like, I just hope whatever you do, you get back to it. If you weren't going to do it, I was going to ask you, what do you think about chapter 19? So glad you got to that. That's just perfect. Thank you.
That's great. Well, hey, I think this has been a good discussion. Hopefully it's helped you in your preparation, Jim. And
it has.
Thanks to our listeners for listening, and stay tuned. We usually publish when Jim gives his talk. We'll publish that on the podcast, and then we started another segment called the After Talk, because I don't know, Pastor Jim, if I've ever said this back in the day when we were roommates, but that I heard somebody say that there's 3 talks. There's a talk that you prepare, or you could say 3 sermons: the sermon you prepare, the sermon you give, and then the sermon you wish you would have given. And so we started another segment called the After Talk, because I know I usually go home that morning thinking, oh, I wish I would have said this, or and so we try to like kind of debrief and say, what would we have brought in that we didn't do? What would we do differently? How would we improve it for the next time?
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.